what is the behemoth? And we first saw mention of the behemoth there in verse 15 of that chapter. And we outlined that we would talk about, we outlined some basic considerations. We talked about the key clause being verse 17. Well, it's first mentioned in verse 15. The key clause that we were focusing on as far as description of what the behemoth was the first part of verse 17. Then we've discussed the verb in there. The verb moves, or what our modern translation use as moves. And then tonight we're going to, after we review a little bit, we're going to talk about the tail and the cedar, what those things are, and then we're going to kind of stitch everything together, that whole passage there, verse 17 as a whole, and see what kind of conclusions that we can put forth. So just as a reminder, some things that we discussed this morning. We talked about the word behemoth, and we talked about it being a literary plural form with a singular verse, and that's a significant thing. And that it, when you see that in the Hebrew used the masculine plural form with a singular verb to pull out the intensity, meaning that you were talking of something grandiose, something large, something in great stature. And so that's something that we want to drive home with people, that we're not talking about a simple beast of the field, like there in verse 15 where it talks. Some people want to say, well, it simply means beast like an ox, but then if we plug that into verse 15, it says, look at the ox who eats in the field like an ox. So why would an ox eat like an ox if it was an ox? That type of thing. Then we pulled out the word Elohim and showed that how it was a masculine plural form with a singular verse, and that was how the Bible used, or the Hebrew used to with the name of God. Then we talked about the three animals that have been passed down since the Middle Ages. And the two being through the Middle Ages, that being the elephant and the hippopotamus, and then some more modern commentators are gravitating towards perhaps a type of dinosaur. And let me just put that out there for a minute. I'm not saying that it is a dinosaur. It's just the plausibility of it being a dinosaur. The dinosaur being something that, as far as modern science, this idea of creation, this idea of evolution, they want to count these fossilized remains of something being millions, if not billions of years old. And of course, that kind of clashes with the idea of creation, especially if you take what they call the young earth view, where if you count all the generations that the Bible calls out, that about the most that you can get out of the age of the Bible from creation would be about 10,000 years. So there ends up being a disparity there with modern day science versus the chronological events in the Bible. And so how do we answer that? And this might be one of the plausible arguments. Again, I'm just saying that it's a plausible, I'm not saying it is, but this might give credence that these beasts, these huge animals, were around during the time of man. And we can look at some other fossilized evidence that even, I think, reinforces that at a later date. So these were the three beasts. This is like a Brachiosaurus. That was the largest of the sauropods that we put forth. Then we moved on to the key clause, that being he moves his tail like a cedar. And then we pointed out the various translations, and we see that even the translators kind of have a struggle with this verb here, this singular form of this, where some call it bend, some calls it move, others says sway. So we can't really gather anything from the varying translations of the Bible. They all kind of differ on what that verb is, if you will. And then we looked at the older translations. The Septuagint dates back to the time of Christ, and then the Latin Vulgate would be just in the early centuries, if you will, after the death of Christ. But anyways, the Septuagint sets up or erects. So the Greek interpretation of that Hebrew word was like to erect, and then the Latin Vulgate says ties up or binds, the idea of making stiff, if you will, and that's what we saw in those translations that we saw there on the previous page. But the point was that we see significant variance in the interpretation of what that verb is, and so then, so how do we reason into that Hebrew verb what the clause, it becomes problematic. So then we started looking at the verb, and we looked at Strong's, and we saw that that there was two primitive roots, or two root definitions for this, and one of them is to incline to, which is this bottom one here, figuratively to mean desire, any and all, delight, favor, like. Here's this move, but then we see that was the definition A, if you will, but then we see here that he further defines it, says by implication or literally, but rarely defined as to bend, and that'd be looking more towards like what we saw there in the Septuagint. So then we pointed out, we read from some varying commentaries, and that talked about this root A versus root B, and that most commentators also assumed that the behemoth was a hippopotamus, and then we evaluated some of their. Well, I guess they would say, well, this B sounds like a hippopotamus, but then there's a however comma, and we looked at some of those however comma arguments, and Anderson said, well, yeah, hippopotamus fits this passage best, but then he says, but it's hard to see how his tail can be compared to a cedar, and we'll look at a hippopotamus' tail here pretty soon. And then Pope, he put forth, again, that he says that this sounds most like the hippopotamus, but that God must have been using hyperbole to describe the beast's tail. And I don't know about you, but when I read that passage, it doesn't sound like hyperbole to me. And then we looked at Hansen and Hansen from their commentary, and they say, and they're they were the most absurd, if you will. They put a footnote in there that says, our author, that being God, must have been misinformed about the hippopotamus. Now, I don't know if they was literally calling out God, or if they was saying that Job didn't understand what the hippopotamus was, or whoever recorded the book of Job, was mistaken. But from there, again, we have to look at, in the big context of what that phrase is actually saying, is if this is the inherent word of God and it was inspired by the Holy Spirit, then how could the author be misinformed about what a hippopotamus is? Because it literally, in essence, it really is the word. It is God's spoken word, and that's how we understand the Bible to be. So this is kind of an insulting phrase, if you ask me. So if we, that's where we left off this morning, and I moved this slide up. I had it a little bit later, but I moved it up. I think if we go back to our elementary school or junior high years of school when we used to, and I think they quit doing it, but they diagrammed out sentences, perhaps it'll help us make a little bit more sense in the English. So I underline the verb. This is what we're talking about. Verb moves. And if we start diagramming coming across, he is considered to be the subject clause, or he referring to what the subject of that sentence is talking about, and that would be the behemoth. Then this is what the verb is actually talking about. It's what they call the direct object. That's a direct object in that sentence. And then comes in this here, this like a cedar. This is what they would call a prepositional phrase. This like further defines what move is. And so, and if you, I'm not going to get into a lot of it, but if you really want to get way down the weeds, there's a lot of discussion on this prepositional phrase as to where it actually goes. Does it go with the verb? Does it go with tail, or does it go with he? I think it's pretty straightforward that it goes with the verb, because if the direct object is the tail, then it's just further defining what move is. But the purpose of this exercise is to diagram out that sentence to try to make sense of it from an English standpoint. And I think that what would you say, common sense would tell us that that the prepositional phrase goes with moves, and that moves is in reference to the tail. And so then we can talk about what the tail is and what the cedar means. So this is where we're starting anew. Several passages in the Old Testament make a comparison with cedars because of their great height. And let's just look at some of these. 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 23. It says, "By your messengers you have ridiculed the Lord, and you have said, with my many chariots I have ascended the heights of the mountains, the utmost heights of Lebanon. I have cut down its tallest cedars, the choice of its junipers. I have reached its remotest parts, the finest of its forest." Any idea what cedars is referring to here? Granted, we're talking about, it is referring to the great height, but in that context here, this is metaphoric language, if you will, and it's probably referring to the princes and the nobles of that nation. So again, it's being used to establish people that are high in the hierarchy, if you will. So cedar, again, the cedar is being used as a metaphor for something that is great. If we look over at Isaiah chapter 2, verse 13, it says, "For all the cedars of Lebanon, tall and lofty, are in all the oaks of Bashan." Again, that's referring to their leadership, if you will. Then Isaiah 37:24, it reads, by your messengers you have ridiculed the Lord, and you have said, with many chariots I have ascended on the heights of the mountains." Is just a repeat of 2 Kings. And then Ezekiel 17:22 reads, this is what the sovereign Lord says, "I myself will take a shoot from the very top of the cedars and plant it. I will break off a tender sprig from its topmost shoots and plant it in the high and lofty mountains. Now again, that's Ezekiel using metaphoric language to describe that he was going to raise up another monarchy in the line of David, kind of messianic prophecy, if you will. So again, it's talking about the hierarchy or the height, using cedar as in like the highest part of the monarchy, if you will. And then finally in Ezekiel 31:3, we see, consider Assyrians, once a leader of Lebanon with beautiful branches overshadowing the forest. It towered on high, its top amongst the thick foliage. So again, once a cedar in Lebanon, talking about how great the nation of Assyria once was, or how it towered over all the other nations at one time. So we just pull those out to show that cedar is often used to show the order of magnitude of something when it's in the Old Testament writings. It may be that in Job's 14, in our clause or in our phrase here, that the tail is compared to the cedar for its height. It could suggest the interpretation of the behemoth tail is lifted high. This idea of being bent or lifted up, if you will. So we know previously that in the Septuagint that the Septuagint interpreted that verb in the sense of erects could possibly be the very most correct sense that we've looked at thus far, and that is the oldest interpretation from the Hebrew, or translation from the original Hebrew text. So the book of Job is, the other thing we want to point out about the book of Job here is that the book of Job is independent in several ways from other Old Testament books. It never mentions Israel. It is considered by some to be the oldest book of the Old Testament. Many believe that it predates Genesis and Exodus, the writings of Moses, if you will. And thus, the literary expressions used in Job need not to be strictly interpreted in light of the imagery found elsewhere in the Old Testament. So, again, we're not saying that's the case, but it could be that we don't need to. If somebody wants to, say, well, it was interpreted like this over here, so that must mean that here. Well, no, the book of Job is different, and the imagery used elsewhere in the Bible does not necessarily have to be used to conclude that that's how the same imagery is used in the book of Job. And so thus the vertical height of the cedar itself need not be stressed here. Allowing for an interpretation in that the cedar is mentioned simply for its great size or length. In other words, we're not saying that it means that the tail is as high as the cedar, but it is just the grandiose or the order of magnitude that the tail may be. Such as a cedar lying horizontally on the ground is just as much as of a cedar as one standing vertically upright that's never been toppled over. There's still a large tree, if you will. The other point, one of the points we want to make here is that some suggest that the word tail here could be interpreted as trunk, and this is where this idea of elephant comes into play. And in fact, if you have an NIV, I think a lot of brethren call it the nearly inspired version, but anyways, the NIV is they've taken phrases and tried to match it up with modern day phrases, and some it's not a word-for-word translation, but what they call a phrase-to-phrase translation, and some things have been lost in it. So it's probably not the best translation to be using. But nonetheless, the point is that its translators has a footnote talking about the trunk, or that this beast is possibly an elephant. So the most glaring objection to this idea is that the reader later, what we read in verse 24 when we read about the behemoth. And if you look there in Job chapter 40, verse 24, it says, "Can anyone capture it by the eyes, or trap it and pierce its nose?" Now let that sink in for a minute. Can anybody capture it by its eyes, or trap it and pierce its nose? Again, I probably should have put that verse up here, but it's obviously the Lord's referring to it as being an elusive animal. And then, can anybody trap it? This could either be because of how big it is or how powerful this beast is. But why would he says, or pierce its nose? Again, if we go back to the beginning of this, back to verse 15, where it talks about the ox in the fields, we know that oxen often are pierced through the nose, and that's how they would do that, so that they can lead those beasts of burden around. And so what the Lord's saying here is that when it comes to the behemoth, nobody can pierce its nose, that it's such a great beast, that it's such a magnificent animal, if you will, that I've created, that nobody can pierce its nose like that of the ox. So why would it be back here be talking about, when we look at the NIV footnotes, saying that this thing that like a cedar, why would it describe it in verse 17 that its nose is like a cedar, but then say that nobody can pierce its nose down in verse 24? If that's the case, wouldn't it use the same verbiage or same descriptive nouns, if you will, in both places? That's my point, is that if that's the case, then verse 24 should have been talking about not piercing a cedar, or not being able to pierce its nose, or that word for nose should have been used up in verse 17a, if you will. But God, in His infinite wisdom, did not use the same descriptive nouns in verse 17 as He did down in verse 24. So therefore, I think we can conclude that verse 17 is not talking about the nose of the beast. However, like we say, mid-century or Middle Ages theologians grappled with what the behemoth could be, and so they were just throwing out large beasts that they knew of as far as plausible beast, and that's where we think that the thing, not clearly thinking through what they were saying. If that's the case, if we know also, if it is referring to an elephant, that an elephant's nose can be pierced, can it not? Yeah. The elephant has become a beast of burden as well, if you will, like over in Asia, especially in India. They're used to plow fields, to trek through the jungle, to move large things. And so, while I don't think it's a custom that they actually pierce their nose, man has tamed the beast to the point that it could pierce the nose of an elephant if it was a benefit to man. But they definitely put shackles on the elephant's legs to keep it under control. And so the point is there in verse 24 that God's saying that no man can put this beast under his control. That's the reason for referencing the beast, the behemoth's nose cannot be pierced. Or he's asking who can do it, because the Lord doesn't know anybody who can do it. So this animal cannot have a trunk described by a tail and a nose of a distinction is what we're trying to say. So anybody that wants to run down the rabbit hole of the NIV saying, well, that's basically the conclusion that we're trying to make here, is that the animal can't have a trunk, which is a tail, then also have a nose of distinction over in verse 24. It just makes no literary sense whatsoever. And since the Lord is infallibly speaking in this passage, why would he not have used nose in verse 17 in the behemoth if it was an elephant to begin with? Why wouldn't he just be talking about how grand the trunk of the beast was, or how grand the nose of the beast was? The word for tail here, and this being the Hebrew word, or that's if you can read Hebrew, that's what it would look like. I can't read it, but I can definitely copy paste it though. Occurs 8 times in the Old Testament. Each case, the key idea is the base of or the end of something. It may also mean inferiority. In other words, which is also the natural way that we use it in the word figurative in English. In other words, if you are in the tail end of the organization, it means that you're probably at the worker bee, or you're at the entry level, not the cedar part of the monarchy or the upper echelons of the corporation, if you will. We would use, if we was using this imagery, we would say that the CEO is like the cedars of Lebanon, but Jim Love is in the tail end of the organization. That's how we would be using this language. So again, tail and cedars doesn't really go together, even if it's even from a figurative standpoint. So what can we deduce? I was trying to say conduce, but that's not a word. What can we deduce from our observations? Well, there is no linguistic justification for a sense of harden or stiffen. Is one thing that I think we can deduce from our slight evaluation of what the Hebrew means, and that the Septuagint suggests the idea of erecting or lifting up or moving that of a tail. So it then is reasonable that one can compare the tail of this animal to a cedar if that's the case. And again, the metaphoric language here meaning that it's a large appendage, if you will. Either from its heights, it would make us assuming that is listed, or great in length of size. So either way you wanted to take it, if it's to erect, if that's how the sense is being used to refer to the tail, it doesn't matter if it's being lifted up or if it's just referring to it being stretched out. Either way, it fits grammatically within that phrase. And then the elephant and the hippo's tail are thus completely inappropriate for such a comparison. And then I have here, but in contrast, the idea of the dinosaur with a very large tail is quite appropriate. And if we evaluate different types of dinosaurs, which we're not going to go through them all, but we're just going to, the classification of what they call the sauropods have been found, which are very large, have very large or very long tails, and that it's believed that these beasts use their tails not only for balance but also as a weapon, that it was like a type of of ancient bullwhip, if you would, that they would snap their tail at whatever whatever enemy that they would have been trying to come at them. So these very large tails were worthy comparison with trees of cedar, if you will. And if we come back to our phrase here, I thought I took this is a hippo tail right here. So you can see it's pretty large, not. And then this is the tail of an elephant, which is a little bit bigger than this, but still in relationship to what the size of the animal is. I don't think that the Lord would use a cedar to describe either one of those tails, if you will. So I think we can say that those are not like cedars. However, again, if we take this idea of a sauropod, this is a Bronchiosaurus. It was the largest of all sauropods. This grid is laid out in meters. I can only find one in meters, but so if we look at this grid, this would be we can tell by the size of the ears that this is an African elephant, which is the largest breed of elephant. That this elephant, if we was to measure in this grid, would be about 16.4 feet, about 16 and a half feet long. So that even if we take the animal as a whole, that really doesn't measure up to what a cedar would be. However, the Bronchiosaurus here is being measured at 25 meters as a whole, and 25 meters is 82 feet long. And then if we look here, its tail is basically from 15 meters to 25 meters, which gives us a delta of 10 meters. That would give us a tail that is 32.8 feet tall. Now that would be a good description of a pretty hardy tree, would it not? I would believe probably some cedars would probably grow larger than that, but I would say that's probably the average size of what we know of to be a cedar. And then this man is even larger than average size. He's about 2 meters or a little over 6 feet tall in this diagram. So based upon all that we know of this passage, if you will, and as far as what's being described here in the book of Job, and again, I'm just picking out a couple verses. Starting there in verse 15, we'll just read through 24. It says, "Look now at the behemoth which I made along with you, which is made along with you. It eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in its stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of its thighs are tightly knit. Its bones are like beams of bronze. Its ribs are like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword." In other words, the only person that can smite this beast is the one who made him. In other words, God. "Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in a concert of reeds and marshes. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into its mouth. Though he takes in his eyes only, or one pierces his nose with a snare." We can obviously, it's talking about, the Lord is talking about a large beast. That a beast that can go into the Jordan River. Now, granted, the Jordan River is not like the Ohio River. It's more like it's a large Wills Creek, if you will. but it's talking about at the utmost heights, that like flood level rushing through and that this beast could go into there and put its mouth in and drink from it without being washed away. So obviously I think that the Lord here is talking about a large beast. So now let's just kind of bring it as a whole and look at this passage as a whole. The elephant is noted for its trunk, its great size, especially its feet, if you will, and its enormous appetite and its ears. None of the unique features are mentioned in this passage, though. We just read of all the descriptive terms or the descriptive language of this beast, and it doesn't match that of what we know of the elephant to be. Also, the elephant retreats to the depths of the forest during the hot part of the day, whereas this beast went to the marshes, if you will, and was up underneath the willow trees. And this does not seem to fit Job 40, verse 21, which suggests that the behemoth spends its time in the marshy areas. When we look at the whole description of this beast with that of a hippopotamus, the hippopotamus is noted for its weight, its large mouth, and its deadly tusk, its thick skin, and its ability to walk on the riverbeds for long periods of time. It spends most of the day in the water as its skin dries out very quickly in the sun, and it actually will sweat. It will like sweat blood, if you will. Pink sweat if it gets too dry. Again, none of these unique features are mentioned in these passages that we know of this beast. Now, yes, the hippos probably could be in a swift-moving current or whatnot, but they don't go to the marshes, if you will, and they don't feed in the mountains. However, when it comes to comparing a dinosaur in this passage, the main features of a dinosaur are really unknown. In other words, we don't know exactly how they eat or what they eat or exactly what they look like, but we know of their skeleton what they are, except for the size of the bones, which indicates that they were some that were much larger than any animal alive today. And again, he said that their bones were like bronze and their ribs were like bars of iron. So obviously he's speaking of bones that were really, really large and really strong. There is nothing in the passage to eliminate the possibility that God was describing in Job 40 was a sauropod or that of a dinosaur. Other than if you wanted to take that a dinosaur lived billions of years ago and was wiped out by a meteor, and he couldn't have been around when Job was around. That's about the only way that you can rule out a dinosaur, I think, in this passage. So until 150 years ago, few knew of extinct dinosaurs. Men weren't really out there doing a lot of archaeology work, digging up things, and thus why scholars of old would not have mentioned the dinosaur as the behemoth. Again, they were just trying to do the best with what they knew, and that would answer why Pope and some of them struggled with their interpretation. Well, hippo fits probably the best of any beast that we know. It really doesn't fit that well in this passage. So we can conclude, or from our lesson, we evaluated some basic considerations for this passage. We looked at the key clause, that being verse 17a of Job 40, and then we looked at the bird moves and what it could or could not mean, and then we looked at what the tail was in relationship to cedars, and that it was obviously speaking of something that was in large order of magnitude, and then we looked at the whole passage in relation to the elephant, the hippo, and the dinosaur. So the behemoth in Job 40 certainly suggests a very large animal. No known living animal fits that passage adequately, if you will. I think if we take all of those, if we list out, and I probably should have done that, but listed out all the descriptive terms of that beast, there's nothing that really fits that known in today's animal kingdom. And that the most natural interpretation of the key clause there in verse 17 is that the tail of the behemoth is compared to a cedar for its great size. And therefore, concluding that the behemoth was a large animal now extinct, which had a large tail, is not an unreasonable conclusion that somebody could reach. And thus, some extinct dinosaurs should be considered for Job. And so as we look at, once again, we look at these three B's, I think we can rule out that that's not a cedar, so we can take him out. And well, this might be a little bit bigger. It's more like a branch, where the other one's like a twig. And where the sauropod, that would definitely be like a cedar and would match the description that we see there. And that's my lesson on the behemoth. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you got something from the lesson. Hopefully this has armed you with some facts that, it is a talked about, especially if you get in around people that are big on evolution. They like to throw this in out there to say, well, you guys don't even know what you're talking about when it comes to the behemoth. It's people, it's this or it's that type thing. And this will give you arm you with some facts that you can throw out there. Not that you have to be able to quote Pope and these other ones, but it gives you some facts that say, oh, well, did you realize? And then they can go and look it up for themselves. So I hope that it's been good for you. And either next week or the week after next, we'll look at three liberal theological arguments of what the behemoth is, and we'll tear apart those and show that those liberal arguments actually do a lot worse, a lot of bad for the Bible, and we'll shred those apart and show that those guys didn't know what they was talking about. So now we want to extend the invitation. Hark the Gentle Voice, correct? Song 840. And